This Excellence in Capital Projects, we put together a webinar series to take from collective experiences of multiple different people and companies coming out of healthcare, manufacturing, and the oil and gas and heavy infrastructure industries. And what we've found is there's a lot of similarities within these big capital projects, and then there's also a lot of differences. And the differences in the capital projects have led each type to really come up with specialized solutions in different areas. And the goal of our companies and this overall series is to share the best practices from capital projects in different industries to cross-collaborate, cross-pollinate those ideas. So the three companies involved in this is Lean IPD, Growing Operations Advisors in Germany, and Owner Team Consultation in South Africa. And when the panelists introduce themselves, they'll talk a little bit more about their firm. An overall highlight of the agenda today, we'll introduce the faculty, we'll lay out a definition for capital expenditures, talk about why CapEx is so important to the future of companies, and then along with that, it being very important, but why is it so complex? And especially with larger, more complicated projects, they're getting infinitely more complex. So with that, we'll look at the peculiarities, the differences within the different capital projects and the solutions that have been applied, and then introduce the overall webinar series and end with a question and answer. So to introduce myself, my name is James Pease. I'm currently working with Sutter Health in Northern California. We are an integrated healthcare provider. Over the last really 18 years, we've had to completely rebuild about 7 of our hospitals because of new seismic regulation in California. And through that, we've gone towards lean and integrated project delivery, away from design build and even CM at risk, just because we were not getting good, reliable results. And from that experience, I've started a website, leanipd.com, that's 100% focused on sharing the information that we've learned through presentations and webinars, case studies, and pushing that information out. So that's a little bit about my background. I'll be talking through the series about the application of lean and integrated project delivery for healthcare projects. Next, I'd like to let Freek van Heerden introduce himself.
Good afternoon. It's very nice speaking to you all, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. So I'm Freek van Heerden. We have a company, Owner Team Consultation, where we actually try and help owners put projects together. Before this, I worked for Sasol, a petrochemical company in South Africa, for a long time, and before that for African Explosives and Chemical Industries, which was really a subsidiary of ICI. Most of my time I spent on developing projects, either as a project manager or an engineering manager. The latter part of my life, I was really engineering manager, engineering director. And one of the big jobs was to try and scope a project so that the project is actually viable, it will meet the business needs, how to manage the scope, and really how to integrate all the engineering disciplines into a line team to execute the project. You can see there the types of projects that we are presently involved in, coal bed methane, pulp and paper, coal and gas to liquids. Of course, we have a lot of technical knowledge around that. And then we help owner organizations to really improve the way they execute projects, and we do third-party reviews on projects for financing or third parties. So that's really myself. I think up to Davide now.
Thank you, Freek. Davide Cronchi speaking. Hello, everybody. I'm talking to you from Hamburg in Germany. I have the honor to be here today and I present my company, Growing Operations Advisors. We have been created a couple of years ago, or not yet, 1.5 years ago, specialized in operational excellence, CapEx, and digital transformation. We are industry guys, so working in factories. This is our environment. Myself, I started my career after being graduated mechanical engineer at white goods manufacturers, and then I moved to automotive. And after 9 years, I decided to join McKinsey as an operational expert, and I've been there until last year. At McKinsey, I had the pleasure in 2009 to start what is today called Capital Productivity Practice, which is a group of the firm that is only looking after CapEx, which is optimizing recurring and also optimizing large CapEx projects. I've been working in many different sectors, but my home turf is manufacturing, it's discrete manufacturing, so it's automotive, it's pharma, and been also working in oil and gas projects, but this is my expertise from the last 20 and more years. I would like to go to the next page to start talking about the content of today. What is CapEx? Maybe I would expect that most of you that are joining are experts in CapEx, so maybe these are words that are for somebody useless, but let me start talking in general. Capital expenditures are funds that are used by a company to acquire, upgrade, or maintain physical assets. And because they are working because they are expensive, longer term expenditures are shared over time, 5 to 10 years, and the depreciation is something that is going to reduce the profit, and therefore is a tax opportunity, a tax deduction opportunity. The differences in industries that you can see on the right-hand side of this page show quite an interesting gap between what you see on the left, which is gray, non-cyclical sectors like utilities, and what you see on the right, cyclical sectors like typically auto or pharma. It's not a question of who is spending less, it's better. You can also drive to death one company by not investing. Here is just that different sectors have different needs in terms of capital expenditure. But one thing is clear, when we zoom in into one single industrial sector, we see a lot of differences, and these differences are not always motivated by a better performance. So it's really sometimes a different way of spending CapEx, which is often telling a bit of opportunities to be better, to have a better CapEx practice. But capital is not an easy topic. The nature of CapEx projects is so heterogeneous that indeed in a company nobody has a full overview of what is spent. This chart is talking about automotive. It's an example of 100% of CapEx that you see at the end of the year spent. 80% circa it's going into industrial CapEx. And then there is quite a cut 50-50 between what is recurring and what is occasional CapEx. You can imagine recurring are smaller type of projects, are those ones that help you to keep your current operations ongoing. And then on the other side, you have the occasional, which is more on strategic point of view, new factories, for instance. But still, when you zoom in once more, you see that there is again another different type of CapEx. You will see equipments, you will see buildings, you see also in the in large projects the indirect costs, which are typically project management, which, as you see, it's quite an important percentage. So heterogeneous, this is the topic, which is therefore also complex. Now, on this page, number 11, we are zooming in on the recurring CapEx. They are the vast majority of what each company is deciding every year to spend. We see really 80 or even more % of the requests for CapEx are these type of projects. An end-of-life replacement of equipment or a mandatory upgrade of filter in order to reduce pollution. These are the typical projects that are under the recurring. There is a lot still to achieve here because they are typically not receiving the right attention. There is also another problem with the recurring CapEx, which is they are collected by the periphery of the company and they land into few decision points, often the CFO, overwhelmed in a very short period of time, typically during budget season, with projects that people don't even know what they are all about. So we have seen very often projects that you don't even find who was the owner that is able to explain the rationale behind this. So an improvement opportunity for sure, even if we're not talking about large. On this page, we see the large projects. So these are typically when we build a new factory. And you can imagine there are companies that build a new factory every 10 years. So that one new factory must be the silver bullet that will create a lasting competitive advantage for the growth of your company. So you cannot fail. You cannot fail, but of course, since you don't have the crystal ball, what is very important is to have an investment which is flexible, that can be still good even in the time coming. For this, there is attention, so you find experienced project managers, but typically the team behind is not so experienced. Can you imagine that if you're developing a new factory every 10 years, probably the same people that 10 years ago were in the company are not there anymore. So there is a lot of replacement and a lot of loss in experiences. The last item on this list is that we are seeing in many industries that CapEx itself is not the biggest lever when you want to optimize the cost of goods sold. Automotive, for instance, if you can see cost of goods sold, maybe 5 to 7, 8% is depreciation. So people are typically going to optimize material cost, which is 60, 65, or labor. So CapEx typically was not the focus, but it's getting more and more focused because CapEx is a limiting factor if you want to develop your strategy. Think about how many models a car maker today has. And these models need to be kept maintained. There is a model year, there is new models to come every 7 years. So there is a lot of CapEx that needs to be taken in order to keep growing. So I think at this point, I will hand over to Freek to talk about important aspect of CapEx.
Right, thank you, Davide. So as Davide mentions, a lot of attention are normally paid to cost cutting or optimizing cost of operations and so on, and making sure you are actually selling your project or products that you make. So you see revenue coming in, you see optimization of costs, but investors invest in projects to really get a return, and any business needs certain facilities on the ground, and this is really the CapEx that you spend. And CapEx planning normally is a top-down and bottom-up thing. So from the bottom-up, people will come with requests and ideas, and from the top down, the company may have certain strategy. They have an allocation between recurring and once-off CapEx and things like that. And one has to manage this carefully to get an overall return on your investment for a company. And this is what we will focus on, to see what we can do and how different people are optimizing their CapEx spend to really get a good return. And if you look at good performing companies, like the top quartile companies on S&P or something like that, and you look at cost efficiency and growth of the company, you will find the top quartile companies, they continuously grow and they improve their efficiency and effectiveness. One cannot really have a sustainable company by just trying to save the company or save the money and make the product cheaper. You have to grow and spend CapEx continuously to maintain your competitive advantage. Therefore, the importance of CapEx, I think. Next slide, thanks. All right, so we're going to talk a bit about why is CapEx so complicated to manage, and what are the typical issues tripping up people? So you will see here that CapEx is really a long-term investment. It is a 20, 30, 40-year project. In James's case, even a 50-year project. And it covers the whole value chain from certain suppliers supplying goods to customers buying goods. And the business on the left-hand side must scope a project and a requirement that will meet a certain customer need. The engineers must then design the facility. You must buy the right equipment. You must construct the facility in the right way. You have to operate the facility efficiently. And all these role players have to work together when you actually construct a new facility and make sure all the requirements are properly specified, understood, and executed. And what often happens is these links and feedback loops and even feed-forward loops are not effective, mainly because of communication and things like that, or misunderstanding. And then you have reasons for the project not delivering the business objectives. And last but not least, you see there are all shareholders looking in from the outside. There are investors, there are government organizations, there are communities, and all these sort of people that also expect some benefit from the project. And you need to really try and satisfy all these needs. And that is very complex and requires careful planning and also careful communication. Thanks, James. All right. So the other reason why projects are getting more and more complex and more difficult to meet its business objectives is that projects are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's also driven by competition. And the way, especially like in the oil and gas industry and those sort of industries, in order to remain competitive, people make projects bigger to benefit from economy of scale. So the bigger the project is, the less your unit cost is. And the result is that you get mega projects of many, many billions of dollars. These projects are so big that it's very difficult to get a handle on them. And as you can see there from recent research from IPA, only about 35% of mega projects actually meet their goals. If you have a quick look on the spider diagram on the right-hand side, the smaller the spider circle is, the more successful the project is. But all that I wanted to point out here is the successful projects in the center little circle, unsuccessful projects in the outer circle. You will see that projects fail on all aspects. If it's late, the cost is too high, it doesn't produce what it should produce. We do not find that projects just fail on one of the aspects or so on. And that leads to the reasoning of the Jemima principle. Either a project is very successful or it is very unsuccessful. There's not a mediocre in-between thing on these large projects. And therefore, one has to be very, very careful when you execute these big projects, plan them properly and manage them properly. Right now we come to why we think projects fail and some of the main contributors. So on this pie diagram, you can see that the blue left-hand side, almost 50% or exactly 50% of the reason why projects fail is because of the requirements not defined properly. And this starts with what are the business objectives, what are the project objectives, what are the requirements of the final product, and so forth. If you don't understand that, there is no way you can really expect the project to be successful. So we will spend one whole webinar on how do we define the requirements of a project, how to make sure everybody is aligned and that the project has a proper boundary around which the project can be executed. The second point is scope definition. It goes sort of hand in hand with the requirements. You have to develop a scope for the facility that will meet the business need. And very often the scope is ill-defined. There's a lot of scope growth during the project. So we will talk about how to define scope, how to manage scope, and so forth. Risk management is the next topic, really. Adequate risk management. I've seen in my sort of career that very often projects that failed, the risk was on the risk register, but people thought, oh, this risk will not happen, the probability is too low, and they didn't address it. And then it actually does materialize, and they have no plan for managing that risk. And sometimes it had a big effect. Last bit, communications. Effective communication is very, very important. And the last webinar, we are really looking at addressing the needs for being an effective project team and make sure that communication flows properly. Thanks, James. Right. We also want to look at the symptoms of projects and actually the root causes. People often look at symptoms and they try and treat the symptoms, like the symptom is the cost of the project that slipped or the schedule has slipped. But why is that? Is that because the requirements were not properly done? And you'll see that the actual root causes sort of underlying the ocean, as depicted by that iceberg, is often a lot more. And in order to make sure that the cost doesn't slip or the schedule doesn't slip, you have to find out what the root cause is and really address that root cause. Thanks, James. All right, now we're going to just talk a bit about our different industries and how we've experienced what happens in those industries. Just give you a bit of a view of how these industries differ. So I'm going to talk a bit about oil and gas and downstream type stuff. And as I already mentioned, oil and gas projects are typically very big projects, many, many billions of dollars, fairly long cycle times. You need to plan 10 years or 15 years ahead. You have many companies involved, lots of equipment, and a lot of coordination and contracting to be done. So one can look at this quite carefully and see what you can do. Utilities, on the other hand, for example, are standardized off-the-shelf offerings, and you can get that fairly quickly. And, you know, some power stations these days can be delivered in like 6 months. So maybe we can learn something from that. Okay, I think over to Davide.
Yes, thank you, Freek. I would like to talk about discrete manufacturers. Automotive and home appliances, I would start with that because I see that there are quite some similarities. For the ones that are not expert in cars, you can imagine that a typical new factory, depending of course if there is the engines production or not, it's ranging from 300 millions to more than $1 billion US. Typical development is 2 to 4 years. And one peculiarity of auto is that product is developed very often together with the process and therefore also the investment. It's a lot of projects that every year are generated within cars OEMs. When I recently have looked on research analysis, you can imagine the European manufacturers, every week you see in somewhere there is somebody that is starting a new production line. Could maybe be a model year, doesn't need to be a new model, but you can imagine that every week somewhere in Europe a new production line is starting. So there is a lot of capex, but there is also a lot of development. These guys need to have internally very strong competencies in order to develop these projects and very interlinked with who is developing the product. If we look at white goods, I would say scale 10% less. So a typical project, refrigerators, is maybe 30, 40 millions. 100 millions, I would consider it's often the max, around the maximum. It's a similar developing time as for cars. Also there is a lot of competence internally to be able to develop both products and process and investment. One thing that captured always my attention when I was optimizing these type of projects is, which I call this challenge, it's the needed flexibility is always something that very few people can really crisply define. So how many models should be able to produce the same production line or the same factory? How much do I want to be flexible in volumes? This is a question that typically brings people to oversize a factory because you don't want to be rigid if a certain model is ramping up faster than others. This, of course, it's draining a lot of CapEx. So when we do optimization of these type of projects, we spend a lot of time really, as mentioned by Frank before, to look at the requirements, to understand what is really mandatory, because there is a clear need and there is eventually also a business behind, and what is nice to have, and we scrutinize that very, very carefully. If we look at pharma and food are typically not investing so often. In pharma, very often the investment is a transition of a certain new product from a so-called launch plant into a full-scale steady-state plant. So you're basically creating a bigger plant once the new product that has been launched is established in the market. And because it's not so frequent, the competencies, in my opinion, are less than what you see in cars. So very often pharma companies are involving engineering contractors from the beginning to start designing the concept together. Again, that is the very crucial moment where you define what are the requirements. And in my opinion, if you have already from the very beginning a contractor helping you, which is rather an engineering point of view than a business point of view, the risk is that your plant will be oversized and will have some kind of gold plating. Another risk of gold plating for pharma and food, especially for pharma, is what is called GMP, Good Manufacturing Practice, which is typically the set of rules that you follow when you create a factory that needs to be certified, and therefore processes must be following certain guidelines. Often we see gold plating again with the alibi of the need of GMP, but in my experience, GMP doesn't tell you that you need to gold plate. There are other rules that the GMP is telling. Last point on pharma and food, you always need to consider that when you have completely installed your new factory or new production line, you need to wait for the certification of the FDA, which can take 6 to 9 months. So this is prolonging the development time of the project. Next page, I'd like to talk about wind farms, a completely different example. It's very fascinating to me when I've been participating to optimizing projects in offshore wind. Wind farms are, let's say, a relatively new industry. So what are the typical issues here? There is a small supplier base and there is low standardization. In wind farm, most of the CapEx is in function of the number of wind turbine generators. You can imagine the wind turbine generator itself, the array cables that need to connect the turbines to the substation, electrical substation, and of course also all the installation CapEx, so vessels, in case of offshore, that need to install the equipment, which is a very important part of the CapEx. What do I see here in challenges? If you observe the situation in the last 12 months in Germany, the new public bids to assign licenses to operate a park in German seas, and I think this will come for the other countries as well. You see that who has won the award, the project, has been able to offer a project that doesn't require to have public incentives. So zero incentives means you might be able to, or you must be able to improve your project and your capex, so not only capex but also operating costs, hugely. And that means really think in a new way how you develop that project and how you will operate it. So this is, I think, a game changer that we will see more and more in the next months. I would like to hand over to James for his industry.
Thank you, Davide. So most of my work is around healthcare infrastructure and primarily in California. Healthcare projects take a long time from idea to first patient. So a typical ground up new building would be at least 10 years from the concept that we should build something, even if we know where the site is, to when we open it. But the technology is changing at least every 18 months. So the imaging and the surgical technologies. So what that means is we have a massive amount of change on these projects that we know going in that we can't define everything up front and just build it. Otherwise, we'll be opening a hospital that's 10 years old the day that it opens. And it's very common for us to have renovation projects going on in a new hospital on the day that it opens because we've already determined something's obsolete. The systems are getting increasingly more complicated. So the security, the medical gas, the building controls, the fire alarm. So the integration of all these complex systems makes it very challenging to get these projects done. And then we have a lot of regulatory oversight from different organizations, often with competing codes where it's kind of impossible to make everybody happy. So the challenge of guiding a design and construction team through all of these obstacles is what makes building healthcare infrastructure, especially in California, extremely complex. So with that, we would like to introduce the webinar series that we put together. Davide Freak and I are very excited to bring a combined over 100 years of capital projects experience from multiple different industry types to share what we've learned. So as I go through the layout of the webinar, please remember that there's a Q&A function, so submit questions and we will answer those questions at the end here. So we'll be sharing in each of these webinars our individual experiences. So in the first part, we'll focus on feasibility. It's really back to the causes of breakdowns that Freak presented, making sure that the owner's requirements are set up correctly. And so we'll present how do you do that within healthcare, within manufacturing, and within heavy industry within that part one webinar. The second part will be how do you make sure that you control the scope and that you assure that those project requirements are met throughout the design phase of the project. Part three will compare how construction is managed to make sure that we're aligned with the feasibility and design phases and getting the project built within the budget and schedule that the business plan can support so that you don't have a decaying ROI. And finally, the last part is talking about how do you maintain an effective team? How do you put one together and maintain the communication and collaboration throughout all phases of a capital project delivery? So the way this will look in a webinar format, it'll be the same time as this webinar on Thursday, 7 a.m. on the West Coast, 4 p.m. In South Africa and Hamburg. And we will, the design is to be every 2 weeks. So the first one being on October 11th and the second one being October 25th. Then we'll take 3 weeks for the third one, November 15th, and 2 weeks later on November 29th. So this is set up to be almost like going to a conference where you have access to people from around the world presenting on different project types, but you don't actually need to leave your office. So why should you attend this? You'll discover best practices from capital projects in each of the different industries. So we're all have a lot of ideas about how things get done within our own industries. This is to provide ideas from other industries, from people that have been in those industries for an entire career. And then review the lessons learned. So don't go out and learn by making mistakes when you can learn from other people's mistakes. So we will share lessons learned and best practices. And so through that, you'll learn practical tools and strategies to improve the value generated through your capital projects. And so hopefully you'll pick up some new tips and tricks and new concepts that are implied in other industries that can be directly applied within your industry. And this is also for owners, for designers, for EPC companies, for builders, for consultants and vendors. So understanding what makes a capital project successful through the entire life cycle allows each of us to play our part and challenge our partners in different roles to step up and do their part to make the whole thing a seamless collaboration. So the pricing for these webinars is primarily to cover our costs of putting on these events is $97 per webinar. And the registration will include a recording of the webinar. So within 48 hours, if you're not able to make the live event, you'll receive a recording, and we will be open to answering questions via email if you're not able to make the live event. And you'll also receive a PDF copy of the slides. So just like this webinar, you'll receive a recording and PDF of the slides. So what I think is best about why we've packaged it this way is you won't need to travel, stay in a hotel, get stuck at security in the airport, or take time off work. So if all this content was packaged in a single day, we would have to meet somewhere locally and people would be traveling from all over the world. This allows us to provide this content either at the beginning or the end of your workday. So if you're interested in looking at the whole series, the 4 parts would be $388. But we've set up a package where to register for the whole series, it's $297, which means basically the last one is about $6. So but we want to extend an offer. So if you register within the next 24 hours, you've attended this introductory session. And if you register and use this promo code, just type intro in at the top of the registration page, you'll receive more than 40% off of the registration. So whether you want to register for 1 or 2 webinars, it'll be $58 a webinar and $178 for the entire series, which is $210 off of that, the overall price if you were to register for each of them individually. So from here, we're going to go into a Q&A. If you're interested in registering for the webinar, I strongly suggest that you do that. You can find a link in the email invite that went out. You will also get a follow-up email after this webinar with a registration link. And you will be able to also contact either myself, Davide, or Freek, and we can provide you with the registration information and answer any questions that you may have. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and let's go into the Q&A.
Good stuff. Thank you, James. We got a few interesting questions here. The first one is to Freek. In your experience, you mentioned that requirement definition and scope definition and management is a major issue on projects. In your experience, has it improved at all over the last 10 to 15 years, but specifically in the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, I think it has. If you look at companies like IPA, Independent Project Assessors, or CII, the Construction Industries Institute, they've been driving better front-end loading for about this period of time. If you look at the front-end loading index average over this period, you find that it has improved, and I think there is general consensus that front-end loading is being done better. I'm not sure whether it is just the bigger companies that belong to these are the organizations that really have tried to improve this. An interesting point is that CAI did some recent research where they said that if you look at front-end loading, it's basically sort of an established practice now. And the thing that really enhances the success of a project is how the team works together. And that's becoming quite an important point also. But I think offsetting the whole requirement thing is the fact that projects are getting bigger, skills are getting less, there are less skilled people, many organizations are outsourcing projects. So overall, it's still a big challenge to do a project successfully, I think.
Thank you very much, Freek. Okay, let's move to communication. You mentioned that poor communication is an issue on projects. I'd like to maybe direct this question to David. Are there any practical steps or techniques that one can use to improve communication or collaboration on projects? And the add-on question to this is, what is the real issue? Do you think it's more an IT system issue, or is it more a leadership or people issue, or is it both?
This is a fantastic question, I must admit, because in my experience, it is indeed a mindset problem. So I would consider tools a secondary aspect, but the first aspect is the mindset. Yes, you can have teams sitting together, and this is a very successful strategy. If you consider, for instance, in automotive, the platform concept, where there are teams sitting together for the whole development, included controller, included purchasing, and this is for sure effective. And in the era of digitization, it's a bit strange to say that physical sitting together makes still sense, but me personally, I have the best experiences if the team is sharing the same premises and it's easy to communicate and share things, and also to get this communication that you cannot just have an email or a chat system to transfer. So getting to know each other. Why? Because I think that there is another important aspect, which is the mindset part. If everybody of us is building his own or her own home, we'll never spend money that is not needed. We'll be extremely focused on spending the money where they see the value. And the concept of value, it's something that I often don't see in a development team. Typically, these development teams are made by engineers, and we know, we are many of us engineers, we know how we think. We rather think on technical, so we think about CapEx and delivering on time. We think about technical complexity. Somebody is also excited the more complexity is, but we often neglect the value for the money we spend. So if everybody in the team would focus on the value, would focus on net present value of a certain design feature, those projects, I'm sure, will have a much better return and much less complexity to be managed in the execution phase.
David, you touched on digitalization, and there's a question around it asking if you guys are seeing the impact of new concepts like business intelligence or machine learning, perhaps AI as well, artificial intelligence. Do you see an impact on projects?
I am careful about this. I know that there are big consultancies that are having this topic as one of the core topics in the improvement of CapEx projects. I am careful. I see today good applications of machine learning in terms of estimating costs for certain equipment, because this is one of the key questions when you're developing, and especially when you are optimizing the design. You always need to have somebody that is doing the cost calculation and needs to have an idea what that type of equipment costs or what will be less if you save that part of functionality. And with machine learning approaches, looking at the past, and also looking at development of certain prices of certain commodities, you can approximate quite fairly what could be the price without, of course, going ask to the supplier.
Thank you, Davide. I want to direct the next one to James. James, how do you see the declining lack of skills being addressed in the future as more experienced people are retiring? I mean, if we just look at this webinar, we've got a lot of retired expertise out there, and training costs cost money, and companies are reluctant to spend money. So how do you see the decline in skills impacting projects going into the future?
Another great question. This is definitely within the healthcare market, and I'm sure this is across the globe, something that we're dealing with on a daily basis. There are not people entering, one on the trade side, the building side, people are not entering into the market, going through our union trade programs like they used to be. So I think the average age of union trades is late 40s or something like that. So I see that turning into, for us, more prefabrication. So with the ability to model and drive fabrication out of our 3D building information models, I think that in a way to call it like, to make it more like Legos or more like IKEA, even though the systems are incredibly complex, we're starting to prefab and componentize pieces. And I think we're experimenting with kind of having QR codes that have installation instructions, and they're very much moving from on-site construction to on-site assembly, which will take the skill down. What it'll mean is we're going to need better planners and better technologists, and you still are going to need people that know how these systems go together in order to set up the components and the prefabrication. That's at a high level. I think that's where it's going.
Thank you, James. Freek, Davide, you want to add anything on the skills decline?
Yeah, I can add a bit, and I think the one thing that is happening, and I wanted to mention a bit, is that if people go to standardized designs, you actually find that you can replicate those a lot. So we've been looking at that quite a lot. So you have standard modules. They are manufactured either in a module yard and shipped to site, or an on-site module yard. It's something that's done extensively in Canada, and module yards and modularization is really growing rapidly. And once you have that, you could actually, I think, have very standardized processes. And what it means is you go away from custom designing each and everything, which we are very used to in the oil and gas industry. You know, every plant is designed by the engineers to the nth optimum efficiency. Whereas if you compare it to a power station thing, you get a power station, you order a power station of a certain size, it's modular unless it gets very big, and it's delivered. And I was personally involved in such a modularized power project, and the commissioning time we spent on the standard power station, the modular thing, was probably 10% of the time. 90% of the time we tried to sort out the substation that was a custom design. So I think, going more standardized will help a lot.
Thank you, Freek. I think that's a very good build. We've got two questions about the series ahead, and the one is, let's take that one first. Will we at all address marine projects or shipbuilding projects in the webinars to come?
I can talk a little bit about this. No, we won't address marine projects, but we did look the other way, and it touches on my previous comment. So when we looked at how can we more cost effectively do an oil and gas project, and what does standardization mean, we actually went and looked at what the marine industry does, and it was quite interesting me to see that a ship that you want to buy, whether it be a passenger ship or a cargo ship or what, is made out of standard modules. And you will sit as the owner with the shipbuilder and you say, these are the modules I want you to put together in this ship. And it was quite interesting to me that that's the way they work. I always imagine that a ship is very custom designed. And there are many examples of ship type projects and how they actually increased efficiencies and things on these shipbuilding projects. And also when they moved the ship, even if it's the same ship, from one shipyard to the next shipyard, how they lost efficiencies then. So my experience was a bit the other way around, to go and learn from there. I don't know that we can tell or feed back to them, but maybe they can learn from what we do again.
Thank you, Freek. Okay, I'm going to do, there's two more questions and then we're going to close out. The next question is then also around the webinar going forward. And the question is, will we address the whole issue of contracting strategies, lump sum turnkey, EPCM, the differences and best practices in each?
Maybe James can answer that.
Yeah.
Well, I would definitely cover say lump sum and design build, PM at risk, integrated project delivery. EPC as a concept is not very big in the healthcare market. So that one specifically, although in a way, the way we look at integrated project delivery and structure our teams, I think in a way has an EPC type of a model to it, with some differences.
For me, the one interesting point, Davida, is, you know, there is the standard model where you go and you have an owner, you have an EPC contractor, you have a construction contractor, and so forth. And each one has a certain scope. And what's to me much more exciting is, I think what is in James's area of expertise is how do you set up a contract where everybody partners, everybody works together, and everybody supports everybody else. And I think James will touch quite a bit on that. And I think that's part of the future. If we can achieve that, I think we can be much more successful.
That's interesting. It talks to the last question, but I think the last question is, are you guys willing to share any tools to how to build effective or construct effective teams? But I'd like to say that we're going to cover that in the fourth webinar. So register for that one and you'll get all the info you're looking for.
I think
I think that's it.
It will not just be tools in the last webinar, but it will be ways to make people thinking that the mindset, the behavior in being part of a team like that is the key. I've seen companies, big petrochemical companies with kilos of manuals on CapEx projects, but still there were a lot of money left on the table. So people, yes, they knew the theory, but this theory was applied by people that were not having the value as the first priority in mind. So I think tools are okay, are important. The competencies must be there, but without the right mindset, even the competencies will not be enough.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. James, over to you.
Thank you, Davida. Very, very helpful. Thank you for walking us through the Q&A. Davide and Freek as well for laying out the reason for this webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We really look forward to seeing you again on October 11th when we kick off with the feasibility and setting up the owner's project requirements. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, whether you're just starting or coming to an end. And with that, have a wonderful day.
Thank you from my side as well. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Davida.
Thank you.
Be well.